Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. Parents of Reddit, what's the scariest or creepiest thing your child has ever said to you or someone else? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
My 2-year-old never stops talking and has said some really weird and freaky things lately. The creepiest one was when we were putting her to bed and she said goodnight to the closet man. And when we asked her who she meant, she told us it was the little man that lived in the small access hatch she has in the back of her closet. The scary thing is that she's never seen that hatch open, and I'm pretty sure she has never seen it before because there has been a big storage tote in front of it since before she was born. You bet I checked the hatch the next morning when she was downstairs and found nothing but dust and spiderwebs in there, so that made me a bit happier. I was driving my son to daycare. It was just the two of us, and I had already dropped my other son off at school. My then 3-year-old said to me, "Mommy, I love you more than my first mommy." I said, "Your first mommy?" He said, "Yes, my first mommy in California. We live in the US, but about as far from California as you can get." I said, "You lived in California?" He said, "Yes. Up until Jason stabbed me, and then I came to you." I said, "Who's Jason?" And then he just started talking about something else. I tried to get more info from him on it, but he never talked about it again. So weird. And I can't imagine where he would have gotten that fodder for it to make it up in his imagination. The only Jason we knew was someone he saw only occasionally, and my son liked him. There was no fear or bad feelings associated with him. The only media he saw at that point was various kids' TV. Still kinda freaks me out almost 10 years later. My kids are autistic, and very minimally speaking, my oldest has a lot of echolalia, repeating words. He does use an AAC device and can communicate with it. The scariest thing he said happened one Wednesday when he came home from school. He always liked it when I asked about classmates, paraprofessionals, etc. He'd giggle, smile, flap his hands, and repeat their names back. On this day I mentioned his teacher. His face darkened, and he looked down at his lap as he very softly repeated her name. He seemed scared. I thought it was odd. I didn't like this teacher. I thought she was unprofessional and didn't know what she was doing. It bothered me that night. I did ask myself, did something happen, but denial was heavy. And I thought, no, that wouldn't happen to him. I found out the next day she had physically assaulted my son and a few other kids shortly before the school day ended. So when he came home scared, it happened about 2 hours prior. So that was the scariest. I learned a very big lesson about looking for warning signs. Tone is everything. Not my kids, but my friends. They were across the country visiting family and out for a drive. Her 4-year-old points down at an old overgrown road, more of a dirt track, and says, "That was where I used to go to school." She told him he didn't even go to school yet, mentioned it to her brother when they drove by another day, and he told her that well down the track used to be a schoolhouse in the 1800s. Same kid was on a walk with Mom in our town around a fairly wooded pond. He asked his mom if they could go another way. She said there was only one path and asked why. He responded, "I don't like that man hanging from the tree." Needless to say, they moved away from that area very quickly. I was at a silent auction and there was a really creepy 100-year-old doll that I bid on as a joke. Turns out nobody else wanted it, so I won. My wife and I are talking the whole time about how creepy the doll was. As I stood in line to pay for it, my daughter asked to hold the doll, so I gave it to her. A few older ladies started coming up to her and saying things like, "That doll is older than I am, and you're so lucky to have such a pretty doll." I guess because my daughter had been listening to us talking, she would respond with things like, "Did you hear that? She's laughing at you." I tried so hard not to laugh at the look on their faces, but the last one got me. My daughter put her ear down to the doll's face and with a very serious look said to a lady, "I think the doll just said the F word." My toddler, 2.5 years old, recently shared a ghost sighting with us. She has done it before, but usually not so confidently. We try very hard not to show her how interested we are, because we don't want her to start making things up, more than she already is, hopefully speaking, lol. Anyway, she stopped mid-play with my husband and me the other day and completely had a mood shift. We had all been making Play-Doh ice cream and laughing and talking. She stopped, looked to her right, and set down her ice cream to wave. She said, "Hi, ghost," pleasantly, and just smiled. Was suddenly much more quiet and observant, more calm, not as lost in the play. Similar to how we'd be if someone passed by us in public or interrupted for a brief moment. "You're still in a good mood, but I'm not going to rudely keep playing instead of saying hello, if that makes sense." It was an open spot of floor above our basement stairs. She was looking slightly up, so it had been about the height of an older kid or taller, and standing on the stairs. We both slowed what we were doing and made eye contact and said, "There's a ghost?" And she says, "Yeah, right there," all smiles. We nonchalantly went, "Oh, there you are, hey ghost." She didn't even incorporate it into her game or make any more of a deal about it. She just started up her ice cream making again and let it be. I think the scary part comes from not knowing what's going on in her little mind, not even the ghost part, because clearly it's quite peaceful.
I do believe that babies and toddlers can see and understand something that maybe we can't. I don't know, maybe it fades in time, but I've always found that very interesting. So, how about you?
I think babies and toddlers are so close to the other side, whatever that is or whatever that means. While I don't have kids, I trust my mom regarding my sister. Two unusual things happened when she was around 2.5 months old. She spoke early and at an advanced level very young. One day my sister tells my mom that she misses the place before this one. My mom doesn't understand and asks what she means. "I was with the light before here," my sister offered helpfully. Not really understanding still, my mom asks if she means before like yesterday or last week. Her bed? My sister shakes her head and says, "Before everything. The light. It's very comfortable there." Mom was weirded out by it, but kids say weird stuff, so she chalked it up to that. Until Christmas. My sister is now in her early 40s. The internet was not a thing when we were babies in the early 80s. She was not in daycare as my mom stayed home with us for a few years. I say this to preface the lack of exposure for what's coming. The day before Christmas Eve, when my sister was 2 years, 10 months old, she tells my mom, "I really want a camel for Christmas." My mom is kind of shaken. She'd never exposed her to camels. She has no idea where my sister got the word or even if she really understood what a camel was. But just in case, my mom took her shitty sewing skills into the laundry room where her old sewing machine was. She cut out a piece of dromedary camel using 2 pieces of brown fabric and sews them together with some cotton balls. She gives the crappy, nearly 2D camel a couple of button eyes and a mouth made of uneven black stitching. Christmas morning comes, and my sister opens up this stupid-looking homemade camel, but without missing a beat, she giggles and exclaims, "Oh good, it's Omar, my camel." If my parents didn't expose her to camels, they absolutely didn't expose her to Middle Eastern names. Yes, that's what my sister decided her camel would be called. Now the last odd factor, my sister and I are not biologically related. We're both adopted. I'm a Hispanic guy of Mexican ancestry, though really my genetics trace back to old imperial Spain. But my sister? Yeah, my sister is Syrian and East Indian. Later I asked my mom if I had said anything weird. Maybe I asked for churros or really wanted a chihuahua or something, but no. My mom shook her head and told me I was essentially silent as a baby. I didn't really cry and didn't really fuss. I was in foster care for a while before the adoption, and apparently my first foster home wasn't great. And though I spoke fairly early as well, I didn't say much, but I understood plenty. Yet I didn't make any creepy requests or have any otherworldly insights like my sister, and so my journey of disappointing my parents began. My kids and my niece have such an uncanny connection. They live in different countries. When my kiddos were 4 to 5, we went for pizza at this little random spot they had seen us drive past. Whatever seemed cool. Kiddo hits me with me and my niece always wanted to open up a pizza shop here when I was in a wheelchair, and niece was my little girl. We lived across the street in that house. Okay, what a cute little story. They're a kid, whatever. Time passes, and we're parked and see a man having a hard time getting his wheelchair out of his van because the parking space wasn't quite wide enough. We should help him. I remember how annoying that used to be for me, and niece instantly took me back to our pizza afternoon. Yes, we helped the gentleman. We chat a bit about the previous life, and the kiddo has things to say that are repeated. Time passes again, and we're visiting my niece. They haven't actually physically seen each other in months, but on video chat and through photos. My niece, learning to walk now, and get her words out clearly, keeps calling my kid Nana, another mother's father, and she gets so excited whenever my kid gets up and walks. I tell my sister-in-law about what my kiddos told me, and she tells me that my niece always wants to go up to the elderly people she sees in wheelchairs, trying to push them or help them with their mobility. My niece and my kiddo get ready for bed while we stay with them, and they insist on sleeping together because they missed each other because my kiddo said it's been so many lives. Not creepy per se, but just always so interesting. I nannied my niece when she was about 1.5 years old. For like a few days in a row, I'd go to put her down for a midday nap, and she'd start waving to the corner of the room behind the door and saying, "Man, man." I could hear her on the monitor, saying it when I closed the door too. She couldn't speak well enough to explain further, so I tried to figure out what she was seeing. I checked the door and made sure the monitor wasn't doing something funny, etc. It was creeping me out, and she seemed so distracted by it. So finally on the 3rd day, I decided to close the door and sit in there with her to see what was going on. Turns out, at that time of day, the sun was in a position to shine through a crack in the curtains and a hanging mobile in just the right way to create what looked like a hand shape on the wall. She was trying to say hand, not man. Boy, was I relieved. I adjusted the curtains and all was well, lol. When my boys were smaller, they had an imaginary friend called Trick or Trick. Trick or Trick, maybe? It never was clear. But my son was telling me about him shortly after we had moved from the old house. Stuff happened there. Noises and shit like that. So he's telling me that Trick or Tricks is really tall. He comes from this old house. Sometimes he takes things that don't belong to him. I ask H, my younger son, if there's anything else, and he said, "He doesn't like you at all, Daddy." I ask him why, and H starts looking nervous. J, older son, about 6 at the time, leaves the room. He just stands there and doesn't say anything. I ask him if then, directly into my eyes, and said, he said to say no. Not my kid, but when my son was in kindergarten, there was this one kid, Jerry, not his real name, who was constantly bullying my son and others. I helped out the classroom a lot, and I was always asking Jerry to stop doing this and stop doing that. At the class winter holiday party that year, I was helping kids make ornaments to take home to their parents. When it was Jerry's group's turn, he pointed the blunt-nosed scissors at me and said, "I'm gonna cut your eyes out." I told him, no, we don't do stuff like that. I made sure my son wasn't in Jerry's class for 1st grade, and the district transferred us to a different school for 2nd through 5th. They redrew the attendance zones, and we were no longer in the zone for the same school Jerry was in. About the time my son was in 3rd grade, I heard Jerry's parents had to pay for a "This is why we don't do this shit" lecture for the entire school. Why? Because Jerry had gone into the bathroom near the art classroom, taken damp paper towels, shoved them into the electric hand dryer, and held down the button in hopes that the paper towels would either short out the dryer or catch on fire. A couple of years after that, so around 5th or 6th grade, I heard Jerry's parents had him transferred to a local charter school that was known as the place you sent your kid if you wanted them to end up in juvie, because it was the one school that would take kids after they'd been kicked out of their regular schools for bad behavior, drugs, etc. The best thing I heard was that Gary was sent into the military after high school graduation to try and straighten his ass out. When my little brother was 2 or 3, he would talk about how he missed his wife and children. I think he had names for all of them too. He would say that he was a general in the war. My parents would play off these comments and didn't think much of them, until one day we drove by one of the oldest houses in town, pre-revolution, and he pointed and said something along the lines of, "There's my old house. Why did they cut down the apple trees I planted for Mary Beth?" He once also told me, my entire family at the dinner table, that he was shot by a man in a red coat in the snow. He was staring at a pile of ketchup on his white dinner plate when he said that. He has no recollection of any of these comments as an adult now, lol. I know 30-year-olds who can't tell the difference between what country homes were built in, let alone a toddler. My 4-year-old son had a habit of announcing when he had to use the bathroom. He would say, "I have to go potty." One time he makes his business known and heads off toward the bathroom. He returns a second later and says, "There's already someone in the bathroom." Now, I do know for a fact that it's just the two of us home, so the hair stands up on my neck. I ask him, "What do you mean?" He repeats, "There's already someone in the bathroom." Now I'm thinking, is it someone I see dead people or someone in a hockey goalie mask? So I grab the biggest knife from the knife block and tell him to stay here. I walk to the bathroom, take a wide angle to see in. Nobody. Slowly and quietly walk toward the shower and pull back the curtain. Nothing. By now my son has walked around the corner and I ask him, "Where did you see the person?" He points to an unflushed toilet and says, "See, someone's already here." His big brother didn't flush the toilet. It's about my cousin's sister. She's much older than me. She was a toddler around 3 or 4 when this event happened. My family lived in a big country mansion in North India in a semi-rural town. My eldest uncle and his wife lived on the top floor. Unfortunately, this aunt of mine slipped on the stairs and died. She was pregnant at the time. This cousin in question was the daughter of my uncle's sister, and she was quite close with this aunt who passed away. After her death, the room was kept locked as the family was in mourning. One fine day, this young kid disappears. It was a big house, though only 7 to 8 of the 40-odd rooms were lived in. So it took a lot of time for a grieving and now panicked family to search for this kid. Suddenly, the bereaved husband had a brainwave to look in his, now deceased wife's room, and the child was peacefully sleeping, doors unlocked. On waking up, she said, "I was here all the time, playing with Mamie." She told me stories and also introduced me to her baby. "Mommy is the wife of your mother's brother, and the lady was pregnant when she fell and died. Her father took a transfer from Rajasthan to Gujarat, and her family stopped visiting our family mansion for years afterwards. This is true because my mother had just gotten married into the family and witnessed it herself." Mental disorders in childhood are real. Please support leaders who support mental health services. As a teacher, I've worked with some students who have been diagnosed with serious mental disorders. One student sticks out almost 10 years later, and I still remember what he said verbatim. The student was intermediate grade 3 to 5. "What if I slit my own eyeballs? When the voice tells me to drink things from the garbage, I just drink a glass of milk. They," referring to the voices, "tell me your secrets. The creepiest one Happened when I had a small group of learners in my room. The student was playing Prodigy on an iPad, completely ignored by the students in the small group. The student appeared to be enraged and engaged in the game. The volume was on with no headphones. Suddenly, the student threw the iPad and then yelled, "I'm not eating her toenails." I just felt sorry for him. He clearly needed help. He was denied help at least then, because they thought he was making it up for attention. I'm not a parent, but I was definitely the kid in the situation. I was about 6 or 7 years old. I had a bedroom to myself. I can still remember it so clearly, like it happened yesterday. And I'm 20 now. For months, I wasn't able to sleep at night because there was a woman in my bedroom in the corner opposite to my bed. This woman was white, elderly, had short hair, like a bob, and a very old-style dress. She looked like a librarian ghost from a typical horror movie. Every time I closed my eyes, she would get closer to my bed, even when I blinked. This led me to constantly having my eyes open every night for months, constant panic attacks and breakdowns over it. I didn't tell my parents for months, and when I finally did, my dad stepped up and told me, and he proceeded to air punch the corner where I was seeing the woman. He beat the shit out of the air in the corner for like 2 minutes straight, swearing and yelling at it. I never had another issue with the woman. She disappeared for good. When I was 18, I lived with my friend and her 3-year-old daughter. I was staying in a basement room that had a little door to access the crawl space under the stairs, but I kept a bookshelf against it because I just felt weird about the door. One night, I was just sitting in bed, and the 3-year-old came in and just looked at the door and said, "Our grandma's angry. She wants to come out of there," and pointed at the door. I was freaked out, but didn't want her to see that, so I asked her to tell me how she knew that. She said the grandma comes to see me in my room sometimes. She has mean black eyes and is scary. I asked her if she could draw the scary grandma for me, and she ended up drawing a human shape with gray curly hair, a blue dress with pink flowers, and black curly hair, drippy eyes. I ended up moving my dresser in front of the door immediately after that, as I had the only access to the crawl space in my room. That freaked me out. She mentioned on and off a few more times about seeing scary grandma and just kept an eye on the door. To make the 3-year-old feel better about it, I went to the dollar store and bought a cheap little spray bottle and made a fancy label on the computer for it saying "Scary Grandma Repellent" and filled it with water. At bedtime, we would go and spray the repellent around the room. I started asking her in the morning if Scary Grandma was still coming to see her at night, and she told me Scary Grandma still comes sometimes. So I don't think it was an imaginary friend or something she made up. At least I know my intuition about the door making me feel weird was validated. My oldest had had times where he'd had been nightmares and he'd used to sleepwalk or talk. One night I heard him speaking to someone in his room, and I was confused because he should have been asleep a long time ago. I walked in to see what was going on, and he was sitting up in bed with his eyes closed, facing the dark corner of his room. He was saying something along the lines of, "I can't go with you. I have to ask my mom. She won't let me leave the house." I asked him who he was talking to. He told me he was talking to a woman standing in the corner. That freaked me out a bit, and I asked him what they were talking about. He said, "She wants me to go down to the water with her. Can I go with her and have a swim?" I said, "No, baby. Go back to bed." Then I laid his head back on his pillow, and he slept peacefully all night. But that was creepy. When he woke up in the morning, he didn't remember anything. My husband thinks it was a weird dream, but I tend to be a bit more superstitious at times. That just seemed too strange. He hasn't been sleepwalking or anything since then, and perhaps he's grown out of it. Bit of background, when my wife was young, her parents and siblings lived with one of her grandparents. Her grandfather was murdered in the home. It happened in his bedroom upstairs. The room was used primarily as storage for the next 20 plus years. Her parents tried to sell the house multiple times, but living in a small town, everyone knew, and the house would not sell, so they stayed. Years later, and while my wife and I were engaged, there was a murder trial which I attended in support of her family. I saw the crime scene photos. Important later. A few years later, we had 2 kids. The oldest was 6 at the time. My wife's family does not talk about the murder, and our kids do not know about the murderer to this day. My father-in-law decided he wanted the room where the murder happened to be a hangout for the grandkids when the family was in town. He put sleeping bags and a TV in the room ahead of a holiday. Day-long get-together. We didn't like it but stayed silent since the murder was a sore subject. My father-in-law also wanted all the grandkids to all sleep in there together. We were the first 10 to arrive, and my son went into a room alone. He usually couldn't sit still long at that age, so after a couple of hours I decided to check in on him. Here's our conversation. During the whole conversation, he was still and rigid and would not look away from the TV. Hey buddy, everything okay up here? Yeah. Okay, have fun. Daddy, do I have to sleep in here? I don't want to. Why not? I'm not alone. Every hair in my body stood up. Well, yeah, I'm here with you. No, there's someone in here with us. Are they nice? Mean? A grown-up? A kid? A grown-up. What are they doing right now? They're watching you. You've never said anything like that at your grandparents' house before, and you've been here a lot. They don't leave this room, and I've never been in here before. Where are they now? Without looking away from the TV, he points to the far corner where his great-grandfather was murdered and said, They're standing over there. They don't move much. Okay, buddy, you don't have to stay in here. And he left the room with me. I'm the kid in the scenario. I was probably 4 to 5, so this was early 90s. My parents would go for drives on the weekends, and this one particular day we were driving through a local native reserve, which wasn't uncommon. There were a few within a 30-minute drive of home, and this one in particular was right on the water, so we'd go with the family often and walk the beach. Apparently, one day from the back seat, I piped up, "That's where the Indians killed my sister," as we passed an old community hall or church or something. I doubt that I would have been aware that 1, we were on a reservation, and 2, that Indians would have lived there. My mom just had a miscarriage back in the late 70s, way before I was around, and she's convinced that she was carrying a daughter somehow, which makes it even weirder. Moved into a new house, 2 stories. First day, and my daughter, 4 at the time, asks to go look at the upstairs by herself. I say yes. She comes back down later and asks why there's a man up there who jumped out of the window. But it gets weirder. The entire time we live there, she refuses to go into the spare room and won't go to sleep unless the spare room door is closed. She can see the spare door from her room and sleeps with her own door open, so I always shut it. I also start to feel uneasy about the things in the room as well, but I assume it's just because she is. I start to avoid the room too. I have no reason to go in after all. One day, she goes to stay with her grandmother for 2 nights. The first night, I shut the spare room out of habit. Second night, I go to shut it and realize, who opened the door? I didn't go in and she didn't do it. And then I realize what was every other night too. We don't go in there. Why is the door always open? We were the only people living in that house. So this was my sister and mother's story, but they don't use Reddit. Now, if you're sensitive to something like exercising, don't read on. So I grew up in New Zealand in the 90s. My sister had to be about 4 years old and kept getting up in the night to sleep in my parents' bed, complaining, "The man keeps waking me up." So after a series of nights of disliking and climbing into their bed, my mom decided to sleep with her on her bed to prove there was nothing to be scared of. She wasn't prepared for what happened and actually only told us the story about 3 years ago, long after we'd left that house and were now into our late 20s. So, Mom is in bed with my sister and suddenly gets woken up by what she described as heavy boots pacing beside the bed and low breathing. But she kept her eyes closed and kept hugging up to my sister to just basically ignore whatever was happening. She said it just felt like someone evil was in there and it knew she was awake. Then it grabbed her ankle and started shaking her leg, like it was trying to rouse her from sleep and get a reaction. After a while of her holding her breath and keeping her eyes closed, it stopped. Then it walked back to the bedside and started on her shoulder, rocking her back and forth for what she said felt like an hour, trying to get her to react. She said she just lay there, trying to not make any sort of movement or to even acknowledge something was there. She didn't sleep at all the night after it, and she doesn't remember how long it went on for, but she said it felt like it went on for hours. The next day, she sent me and my sister off to school like any normal day, so as not to scare us, but after we'd gone to school, called her mother, and they organized with the local church to get a priest out there immediately. She told us they came and performed some blessing on the house to cleanse it while we were at school, and that night, well, we all went into the night, and we ended up just staying at my dad's parents' this night. I still more the wiser as a little 4 and 7-year-old. After that, my sister no longer had any issues sleeping, and my parents kept that little family secret for a good 25-ish years before telling us we had legitimate entity in our childhood home, lol. So yeah, sometimes when your little kid says the man keeps waking up, the reality is there's something there. My little sister refused to sleep in her bedroom for months because she said one night she saw a girl with a long neck that had bent like a snake peered down at her from the top bunk. Well, my mom said she kept having nightmares about this snake-necked, lion-headed creature around the same time. We had some really weird shit happen at our house, like one time I heard a kid crying and a lady whose voice I'd never heard say, "It's alright." Now, I never got out of my room to check if it was a real person because of all the strange paranormal stuff that had been occurring. Turns out, when I woke up the next day, my mom and I had told me she heard the same thing, and another night I heard growling coming from my mom's room when I was playing PS4. Due to all this aggressive and strange paranormal shit happening, we had to clean our own house and bless it, which thankfully stopped all occurrences. For a while, though, everyone in our house was terrified, and no one stayed home alone if we could help it. So what my little sister had said at the time was absolutely terrifying at the time, because it was the start of all the occurrences that really started ramping up in aggression.